The morning light filtered through the crystal walls of the Alterian Council chamber as Thrix reviewed the daily assignment roster. After 40 years of studying alien species across the galaxy, nothing surprised him anymore. He had documented the trading rituals of the Velkar merchants, analyzed the complex mathematics of Zoradan architecture, and even spent 3 months learning the musical languages of the Harmonic Collective. Each assignment had been fascinating in its own peaceful way. Today's assignment appeared equally routine. The holographic display showed a simple request from the Galactic Research Council's Military Analysis Division. They needed a comprehensive study of human combat tactics and warfare psychology for their xenobiology archives. Thrix tilted his elongated head, his silver eyes scanning the brief description. Humans were listed as a Class 4 developing species from the outer spiral arm, still engaged in primitive territorial conflicts. The estimated study duration was 6 months. Thrix had never heard of humans before, but that meant little in a galaxy containing over 12 million known species. The Alterian database showed humans as bipedal mammals from a planet called Earth, roughly 26,000 light-years from Alterian space. They had achieved basic spaceflight only recently and showed typical signs of a young civilization still working through its aggressive phase. Most species went through this period before evolving to higher forms of consciousness and peaceful coexistence. The assignment seemed almost boring compared to his recent work studying the philosophical poetry of the crystalline monks. Thrix had been hoping for something more intellectually stimulating, perhaps analyzing the time manipulation abilities of the temporal scholars or documenting the dream-sharing rituals of the psychic collectives. Instead, he would spend months watching primitive warfare and writing reports about crude tactical maneuvers. He accepted the assignment with a mental sigh, already planning his approach. The study would require reviewing archived combat footage, analyzing strategic patterns, and conducting interviews with human military personnel. The Council had arranged for him to work from Observation Station Gamma, a research facility orbiting the human homeworld. The station maintained strict non-interference protocols, observing human activities without revealing their presence. 3 days later, Thrix arrived at the observation station aboard a Council transport ship. The station itself was impressive, a massive structure that could house over 1,000 researchers from different species. Most of the current residents were studying various aspects of human development, their art, music, social structures, and technological progress. The military analysis section was much smaller, tucked away in the station's lower levels. Dr. Kellen, the station's human studies coordinator, met Thrix at the airlock. She was a tall, thin woman from the scholarly Meridian species, known for their analytical minds and neutral perspectives on warfare. Her pale blue skin had the characteristic shimmer that indicated centuries of life experience. "Welcome to Gamma." "Station, Commander Thrix," she said, her voice carrying the melodic tones of her species. "I understand you're here to study human military behavior. I should warn you that humans are quite different from most species we've documented." Thrix nodded politely. "Different how?" "The initial briefing mentioned they're still in their aggressive development phase. Most species show similar patterns during this period." Dr. Kellen paused at the entrance to the research wing. "That's what we thought initially. However, the more we study humans, the more we realize their approach to conflict is uniquely complex. They don't fight simply for resources or territory. Their motivations run much deeper." The research facility assigned to Thrix was state-of-the-art, equipped with quantum processors capable of analyzing vast amounts of data simultaneously. Wall displays showed rotating images of human military equipment, organizational charts, and strategic maps from various conflicts throughout their history. The setup was impressive, though Thrix wondered if such sophisticated equipment was necessary for studying a primitive species. His first task was reviewing the basic data the station had collected about human warfare. The initial statistics were startling. Humans had been engaged in organized conflict for their entire recorded history, with barely a decade passing without some form of military action occurring somewhere on their planet. The numbers were staggering compared to other species Thrix had studied. The Alterians, for example, had eliminated warfare over 800 years ago after a single battle resulted in 43 casualties. The entire species had been so traumatized by the loss that they immediately developed advanced conflict resolution techniques and had lived in perfect harmony ever since. Most other peaceful species had similar stories of warfare ending after relatively minor losses convinced them to find better ways to resolve disputes. Humans, however, had conflicts that lasted for years and resulted in millions of casualties, yet they continued fighting. Some wars had paused only long enough for the participants to rebuild their armies before resuming hostilities. The data showed conflicts spanning multiple generations, with children growing up to continue fights their grandparents had started. Thrix spent his first week trying to understand the basic structure of human military organization. Their armies were divided into complex hierarchies with specialized roles for different types of soldiers. They had developed separate branches for land, sea, air, and space combat, each with its own traditions and tactical approaches. The level of specialization was remarkable for such a young species. What puzzled Thrix most was the apparent inefficiency of human warfare. They often fought in ways that seemed to maximize casualties rather than minimize them. Battles continued, long past the point where a rational species would have negotiated a ceasefire. Soldiers advanced into obviously dangerous situations, and commanders ordered attacks that had little chance of success. Yet humans had survived and thrived despite this seemingly wasteful approach to conflict. Their population continued to grow, their technology advanced rapidly, and their civilization showed no signs of collapse despite constant warfare. If anything, periods of intense conflict seemed to accelerate their development rather than hinder it. By the end of his first week, Thrix realized this assignment would be far more complex than he had anticipated. Human warfare defied every model. In the Galactic Council's xenobiology database, they fought with an intensity that seemed almost suicidal, yet they had become one of the most successful species in their region of space. The real work was just beginning, and already Thrix felt the first stirrings of unease about what he might discover. The first battle recording began like any other data file Thrix had reviewed in his decades of research. Clinical statistics appeared on his screen: location, duration, participating forces, and environmental conditions. The conflict was labeled as a minor border skirmish involving fewer than 1,000 human soldiers on each side. According to galactic standards, this qualified as barely more than a local disturbance. Thrix activated the visual records, expecting to see the typical pattern of civilized warfare he had observed in other species. Most conflicts followed predictable patterns: initial posturing, limited engagement with minimal casualties, and quick resolution through negotiation once losses reached unacceptable levels. Even the most aggressive species rarely fought to the death when retreat remained possible. The human battle footage shattered every assumption Thrix held about rational combat behavior. The recording showed human soldiers advancing across an open field toward an enemy position. Artillery shells exploded around them, creating massive craters and sending deadly fragments in all directions. Any sane species would have immediately sought cover or retreated to reassess the situation. Instead, the humans continued forward, stepping over fallen comrades without breaking stride. Thrix watched in growing horror as a human soldier took a direct hit from an explosive round. The blast should have killed him instantly, but somehow he survived with severe injuries to his legs. Rather than calling for medical evacuation or surrender, the soldier crawled forward on his hands and knees, still firing his weapon at the enemy position. Other soldiers moved to help him, exposing themselves to additional fire rather than leaving their wounded comrade behind. The battle continued for 6 hours without pause. humans fought through conditions that would have caused most species to immediately cease hostilities. They endured artillery bombardments that turned the battlefield into a moonscape of craters and debris. When their primary weapons ran out of ammunition, they switched to backup weapons. When those were exhausted, they began using improvised explosives and thrown objects. Most disturbing was their apparent disregard for personal safety when their unit was threatened. Thrix observed multiple instances where individual humans deliberately exposed themselves to enemy fire to protect their teammates. One soldier used his own body as a shield, while others evacuated wounded comrades. Another ran directly into enemy gunfire to destroy a machine gun position that was pinning down his unit. The concept of tactical retreat seemed foreign to human military thinking. Even when facing impossible odds, human units continued fighting until they achieved their objectives or were completely eliminated. In one recorded instance, a human squad fought an enemy force 5 times their size for over an hour, refusing multiple surrender demands. When only 2 soldiers remained alive, they detonated their remaining explosives rather than be captured, taking several enemies with them. Thrix paused the recording and checked the data files again, certain there had been some mistake. This was supposed to be a minor skirmish, yet the casualty rates exceeded those of major planetary conflicts among other species. Over 300 humans died in 6 hours of fighting, with twice that number wounded. The surviving forces from both sides immediately began planning their next engagement rather than negotiating peace. The psychological profiles of human soldiers were equally baffling. Post-battle interviews showed no signs of the trauma responses Thrix expected. Instead of expressing regret about the violence, human soldiers spoke with pride about their unit's performance. They mourned their dead comrades, but showed no desire to avoid future conflicts. Many actively requested assignment to more dangerous missions. Thrix began reviewing additional battle records, hoping to find examples of more rational human military behavior. Instead, each new recording revealed even more extreme examples of human combat psychology. He watched humans fight in environments that should have been impossible to survive. Arctic conditions where exposed skin froze in minutes, desert heat that could kill through dehydration, and urban warfare in buildings reduced to rubble by constant shelling. In every case, humans adapted and continued fighting. They developed new tactics for each environment, created specialized equipment for extreme conditions, and maintained unit cohesion even under the most horrible circumstances. Their ability to function in combat seemed almost supernatural compared to other species. One recording particularly disturbed Thrix. It showed a human medic working to save wounded soldiers during an active battle. Artillery shells exploded around him as he performed emergency surgery in a makeshift field hospital. When enemy forces overran the position, the medic refused to abandon his patients. He continued operating even while under direct fire, only stopping when killed by enemy soldiers who seemed equally amazed by his dedication. The more footage Thrix reviewed, the more he realized human warfare operated according to principles he could not understand. Humans fought not just for victory, but for abstract concepts that seemed meaningless to rational minds. They spoke of honor, duty, and protecting ideals that had no physical substance. They were willing to die for teammates they had known for only weeks, and they showed fierce loyalty to military units that existed mainly as symbols and traditions. Human military technology reflected their aggressive psychology. While other species developed weapons designed to incapacitate enemies with minimal harm, humans created instruments of destruction that seemed designed to maximize casualties. Their weapons were not just tools for achieving military objectives. They were expressions of human determination to win at any cost. Yet despite their apparent brutality in combat, humans showed remarkable compassion for civilians and prisoners. Battle recordings showed human soldiers risking their lives to evacuate non-combatants from war zones. They followed complex rules about treatment of captured enemies, often providing medical care to wounded opponents even while under attack themselves. After 2 weeks of reviewing human combat footage, Thrix found himself unable to sleep properly. His dreams were filled with images of human soldiers advancing through impossible odds, fighting with an intensity that defied all biological programming for self-preservation. The Alterian meditation techniques that normally brought him peace seemed inadequate against the flood of violent imagery now burned into his memory. The worst part was not the violence itself, but the growing realization that humans were remarkably effective at warfare despite their apparent irrationality. They won battles that should have been impossible to win, survived in conditions that should have killed them, and maintained fighting strength under circumstances that would have broken any other species. Thrix began to suspect that human combat behavior was not primitive or irrational at all. It was something far more sophisticated and terrifying than anything in the galactic databases. The interview room on Observation Station Gamma felt different than usual as Thrix prepared for his first direct conversation with a human military veteran. After weeks of watching combat footage, he needed to understand what drove these beings to fight with such impossible determination. The holographic communication system hummed quietly, connecting him across thousands of light years to a human who had agreed to participate in the study. The human who appeared in the projection was not what Thrix expected. David Robertson looked more like a teacher than a warrior, which he actually was now, working at a school on Earth. He wore simple civilian clothes and had gentle eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His graying hair and soft voice gave him the appearance of someone who had spent his life nurturing children rather than engaging in deadly combat. "Good morning, Commander Thrix," David said, his tone warm and welcoming. "I understand you're studying human military behavior. I'm happy to help however I can." Thrix consulted his notes, still struggling to reconcile this mild-mannered educator with the combat records he had reviewed. According to military files, David had served in 3 major conflicts, earned numerous decorations for bravery, and personally killed over 30 enemy soldiers in close combat. Yet he spoke as casually as if discussing the weather. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Robertson. I've been reviewing human combat footage, and I find myself confused by certain behaviors. Perhaps you could help me understand why human soldiers continue fighting even when retreat would be the logical choice." David leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "That's a complex topic. I suppose it comes down to what you're fighting for. When you're in combat with your brothers, retreat isn't really an option if it means abandoning them. You fight because they're counting on you, and you know they'd do the same for you." The word brothers puzzled Thrix. Are human military units composed of family members, genetic relatives fighting together? "Oh no," David chuckled. "We become brothers through shared experience. When you've been through combat together, saved each other's lives, suffered together, you develop bonds stronger than blood. I'd have died for any man in my unit, and they'd have done the same for me." Thrix made careful notes, trying to understand this concept of artificial kinship bonds. But why continue fighting when the odds of survival are extremely low? Surely self-preservation would override these social connections. David's expression grew more serious. "You have to understand, Commander, that sometimes there are things more important than personal survival. When I was fighting, I wasn't just protecting my squad mates. I was protecting my family back home, my community, the values and freedoms that made life worth living. Dying with honor was preferable to living with the knowledge that I had failed them." The concept of honor appeared frequently in human military communications, but Thrix struggled to define it in concrete terms. "Could you explain what honor means in this context? It seems to be a driving force in human combat behavior." "Honor is about doing the right thing even when it's difficult or dangerous," David replied. "It's about keeping your word, protecting." those who can't protect themselves and standing up for what you believe in regardless of the cost. In combat, honor means never abandoning your duty or your comrades, even if it means dying in the process. Thrix found this explanation deeply troubling. Humans were willing to die for abstract concepts that provided no material benefit. This violated every principle of rational behavior documented in galactic psychology texts, yet David spoke of these concepts as if they were fundamental laws of nature. I've observed humans continuing to fight even when severely injured, Thrix continued. In one recording, a soldier with multiple gunshot wounds crawled forward to complete his mission rather than seeking medical attention. How do you explain this behavior? David nodded knowingly. Pain and injury become secondary when you're focused on something greater than yourself. I remember being wounded during my second deployment. Took shrapnel in my leg and side, but my squad was pinned down by enemy fire. I couldn't think about my injuries when my friends were in danger. The mission and their safety were all that mattered. This led to more questions about human pain tolerance and psychological conditioning. David explained that military training was designed to push soldiers beyond their perceived limits, teaching them to function effectively under extreme stress and physical discomfort. Humans deliberately subjected themselves to hardship during peacetime to prepare for the horrors of war. We train harder than we fight, David said. By the time you reach combat, you've already experienced worse conditions in training. Your body and mind are prepared for things that would break untrained civilians. Thrix interviewed dozens of other human veterans over the following weeks. Each conversation revealed new layers of complexity in human military psychology. He spoke with pilots who flew missions despite mechanical failures that should have forced emergency landings. He talked to infantry soldiers who fought in urban warfare where every building could contain deadly ambushes. He interviewed medics who ran into active fire zones to rescue wounded comrades. Every human he spoke with demonstrated the same puzzling combination of deadly efficiency and deep compassion. They described combat in clinical professional terms, while simultaneously expressing genuine grief for fallen enemies. They took pride in their military skills while hoping never to use them again. They prepared constantly for war while working actively for peace. One conversation particularly disturbed Thrix. He interviewed Maria Santos, a former Special Forces operative who now worked as a trauma counselor for veterans. She had participated in some of the most dangerous military operations in human history, yet she spent her retirement helping other soldiers deal with the psychological after-effects of combat. Violence changes you, Maria explained. Even when it's necessary, even when you're protecting innocent people, taking a life leaves marks on your soul. We train soldiers to be effective killers, but we also have to help them remain human beings. That's the real challenge of military service. This contradiction fascinated Thrix. Humans created elaborate systems for psychological support to help soldiers cope with doing things they trained extensively to do. They acknowledged that combat was traumatic even while maintaining massive military forces in constant readiness for war. Why not simply avoid warfare altogether? Thrix asked. Your species has the technology and resources to resolve conflicts peacefully. Why maintain these military capabilities? Maria's expression grew sad. Because peace is fragile, Commander. There are always people willing to use violence to take what they want or impose their will on others. The only way to protect the innocent is to be prepared to fight when necessary. We maintain our military not because we love war, but because we love peace enough to fight for it. After months of interviews, Thrix began to understand that human military behavior was not primitive aggression, but sophisticated psychological conditioning. Humans had developed systems for creating artificial kinship bonds, instilling loyalty to abstract ideals, and maintaining fighting effectiveness under extreme stress. Their warfare was not chaotic violence, but carefully orchestrated applications of controlled aggression in service of larger goals. The realization that human military psychology was actually highly advanced rather than primitive should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled Thrix with growing dread. If humans could condition themselves to fight with such determination for abstract concepts, what would happen if they ever united behind a single cause? Sleep had become a luxury Thrix could no longer afford. 3 months into his research, the nightly rest that had once restored his mind now brought only vivid nightmares filled with human conflict. He would wake in cold sweats, his silver skin damp with perspiration, unable to shake images of human soldiers advancing through hellish battlefields with determination that defied all logical explanation. The meditation gardens on Observation Station Gamma offered little relief. The crystalline pools and harmonic resonance chambers that normally brought peace to Alterian minds seemed powerless against the flood of human warfare data that had infiltrated every corner of his consciousness. Even the station's therapeutic, light cycles, carefully tuned to promote mental wellness, failed to ease the growing anxiety that consumed his waking hours. Dr. Kellen noticed his deteriorating condition during one of their weekly progress meetings. The Meridian researcher's pale blue features showed concern as she observed Thrix's obvious exhaustion and the slight tremor that had developed in his hands over recent weeks. "Commander, perhaps you should consider taking a brief rest from this assignment," she suggested gently. "Human warfare studies have proven more psychologically demanding than our initial assessments indicated. Several other researchers have requested transfers to different projects." Thrix declined her suggestion, though part of him desperately wanted to accept. The Galactic Council expected a complete analysis of human military capabilities, and he was beginning to understand why previous researchers had found excuses to abandon their work. The deeper he delved into human warfare, the more disturbing his discoveries became. His breaking point came when the station's archives granted him access to recordings from humanity's most devastating historical conflicts. The files were marked with multiple warning labels about psychological trauma and came with mandatory counseling recommendations. Thrix dismissed these warnings as overcautious bureaucracy, certain that his decades of xenological research had prepared him for any disturbing content. The first recording showed a human city after aerial bombardment during what humans called their Second World War. Buildings lay in ruins, streets were cratered and filled with debris, and civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Yet within hours of the bombing, human survivors were already organizing rescue efforts, digging through rubble to save trapped civilians, and beginning reconstruction work. What disturbed Thrix most was not the destruction itself, but humanity's response to it. Rather than surrendering or seeking peace negotiations, the bombed populations seemed to grow more determined to continue fighting. Their resolve hardened with each attack, their unity strengthened by shared suffering. The bombing had been intended to break their will to fight, but it had achieved the exact opposite result. He watched recordings of human prisoners of war who endured years of torture and deprivation, yet maintained military discipline, and continued to resist their captors. He observed civilians in occupied territories who organized underground resistance movements, despite knowing that capture meant certain death. He studied documentation of human medical personnel who continued treating wounded soldiers under impossible conditions, performing surgery by candlelight while enemy artillery fell around them. The most horrifying realization came when Thrix began analyzing human technological development during wartime. Rather than being slowed by the destruction of warfare, human innovation actually accelerated during conflicts. They developed new weapons, improved medical techniques, advanced communication systems, and created more efficient production methods. War seemed to stimulate human creativity rather than hinder it. Human military evolution followed patterns that violated every model in galactic xenobiology databases. Most species developed warfare to a certain level of sophistication, and then stagnated, eventually abandoning military solutions in favor of peaceful alternatives. Humans continuously improved their combat capabilities even during peacetime, treating each war as a learning experience that prepared them for more effective violence in the future. Their weapons development was particularly disturbing. Humans had created instruments of destruction capable of eliminating all life on their planet multiple times over. Yet they maintained these arsenals as tools of peace through deterrence. The concept of threatening total annihilation to prevent smaller conflicts represented a level of strategic thinking that impressed and terrified Thrix simultaneously. The historical records revealed that humans had survived multiple attempts at complete genocide, not just as a species, but as individual cultural groups within their civilization. Each time, the targeted populations had emerged from near extinction stronger and more determined than before. They commemorated their survival of attempted annihilation as cultural touchstones, passing down stories of resistance and endurance to future generations. Thrix discovered that humans didn't just study their own military history for tactical lessons. They consumed warfare as entertainment, creating elaborate fictional scenarios involving imaginary conflicts. Their literature, films, and interactive games were filled with military themes. Children played war games as part of their normal development. Adults spent leisure time reading about historical battles or participating in simulated combat scenarios. This cultural obsession with warfare extended to their civilian institutions. Human sports often resembled stylized combat, with participants competing for territory and dominance through controlled aggression. Their business practices used military terminology and strategies. Even their educational systems incorporated competitive elements that mirrored military training. The more Thrix studied human culture, the more he realized that warfare was not an aberration or primitive remnant in human society. It was fundamental to their identity as a species. They had built their entire civilization around the assumption that conflict was inevitable and must be prepared for constantly. Their military capabilities were not separate from their civilian achievements, but integral to them. Sleep became impossible as Thrix processed these implications. He found himself pacing the research facility at all hours, unable to escape the growing understanding of what humans represented in galactic terms. Every meditation technique he attempted was interrupted by visions of human soldiers advancing through impossible odds, their faces set with determination that promised victory or death, but never surrender. The station's medical staff prescribed various treatments for his insomnia and anxiety, but nothing could quiet the storm in his mind. He had started this assignment expecting to document the warfare patterns of another primitive species working through their aggressive phase. Instead, he had discovered something far more troubling. Humans were not primitives learning to fight. They were the galaxy's most sophisticated warriors, held in check only by their own internal divisions and moral constraints. Dr. Kellen made another attempt to convince him to take medical leave, but Thrix knew that rest would not help. The knowledge he had gained could not be unlearned, and the implications could not be ignored. Somewhere in the depths of space, humanity was growing stronger, more united, and more technologically advanced with each passing year. The truly terrifying question was not whether humans would eventually turn their military capabilities outward, toward the galaxy. The terrifying question was what would happen when they did, and whether any known species could stand against them when that day came. The final report sat encrypted on Thrix's personal terminal for 17 days before he could bring himself to transmit it to the Galactic Council. Each time he opened the file, waves of nausea swept through him as he contemplated sharing what he had learned about human military capabilities. The truth was too dangerous, too terrifying to release into the galaxy without careful consideration of the consequences. His original assignment had been straightforward: document human warfare patterns and analyze their military psychology for the Council's xenobiology archives. The expected result was a standard report categorizing humans as a typical developing species with predictable aggressive tendencies that would eventually evolve into peaceful cooperation, like every other known civilization. Instead, Thrix had uncovered evidence that humans represented something entirely unprecedented in galactic history. They were not a species working through a temporary, aggressive phase. They were apex predators who had weaponized everything from microscopic organisms to planet-killing technology while simultaneously developing the most sophisticated moral and ethical frameworks the galaxy had ever seen. The contradiction was what made them so dangerous. Humans possessed the capability to wage war on a scale that could threaten entire star systems, yet they constrained themselves through complex codes of conduct that limited their use of violence to what they considered justified circumstances. They could destroy worlds but chose instead to provide humanitarian aid to their enemies. They could conquer through fear, but preferred to win through inspiration and alliance. This duality made them impossible to predict using standard xenological models. A purely aggressive species could be contained through superior force or deterrent threats. A peaceful species could be managed through diplomatic engagement and resource sharing. Humans were both and neither, capable of switching between modes of behavior based on circumstances that other species found incomprehensible. Thrix had documented human military units that fought with suicidal determination to protect civilian populations they had never met. He had recorded interviews with veterans who spoke of warfare as both the worst and most meaningful experience of their lives. He had analyzed tactical manuals that emphasized minimizing enemy casualties while achieving total victory through overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The final version of his report omitted 90% of what he had discovered. He included only basic technical specifications of human weapons systems, organizational charts of their military structures, and sanitized summaries of their tactical doctrines. The psychological profiles that would have revealed the true depth of human military conditioning were deleted entirely. The combat footage that demonstrated their impossible determination was classified at levels that would prevent most council members from accessing it. His official conclusion stated that humans possessed adequate defensive capabilities, appropriate to their development level, and posed minimal expansion threats due to ongoing internal conflicts that would likely prevent large-scale military cooperation. The report recommended continued observation with periodic updates as human technology advanced. Every word of the conclusion was technically accurate, while completely obscuring the underlying reality. Humans did have internal conflicts that currently prevented unified military action. Their defensive capabilities were indeed adequate by any rational standard. They showed no immediate signs of aggressive expansion beyond their local stellar neighborhood. What the report failed to mention was that human internal conflicts were decreasing as their civilization matured. Their defensive capabilities exceeded those of most advanced species by several orders of magnitude. Their expansion into space was proceeding rapidly despite their supposed lack of unity. Most importantly, their military traditions and psychological conditioning were creating a warrior culture unlike anything previously documented in galactic history. Thrix submitted the redacted report through secure council channels and immediately requested transfer to the Botanical Research Division. His stated reason was a desire to study peaceful plant ecosystems after months of focusing on military subjects. The real reason was his inability to continue thinking about human warfare without experiencing panic attacks that left him unable to function for hours at a time. The transfer was approved within days, along with a commendation for completing a difficult assignment under challenging circumstances. Dr. Kellen personally congratulated him on producing a thorough and professional analysis that would be valuable for future xenological studies. Neither she nor the council members who reviewed his report suspected that he had concealed the most significant discovery in galactic history. His new assignment involved cataloging flowering plants on peaceful garden worlds where the most dangerous threat was seasonal pollen allergies. The work was deliberately chosen to be as far removed from military subjects as possible within the research service. Thrix hoped that studying the gentle cycles of plant growth and reproduction would eventually wash the images of human warfare from his memory. The nightmares continued anyway. He would wake from dreams of human soldiers advancing through artillery bombardments that should have killed them all, their faces set with determination that promised victory regardless of the cost. In his dreams, he could see the future. Human expansion fleets moving through the galaxy not as conquerors, but as liberators, offering protection to peaceful species while quietly demonstrating military capabilities that made resistance unthinkable. The best irony was that humans would probably be benevolent galactic neighbors if they ever achieved the unity necessary for large-scale expansion. Their moral frameworks and ethical traditions suggested they would use their power responsibly, protecting weaker species and promoting prosperity throughout their sphere of influence. They would likely create the most peaceful and just galactic civilization in known history. That possibility terrified Thrix more than any scenario involving human aggression. A galaxy ruled by human military might, but guided by human moral principles would be nearly perfect, which meant that resistance to human expansion would not just be futile, but actually immoral. Other species would willingly join human-led alliances, not because they were forced to, but because human protection and leadership would genuinely improve their lives. 6 months after completing his report, Thrix received a priority communication from the Council requesting his participation in a follow-up study. Recent observations had detected increased human space exploration activities, and they wanted his expertise for analyzing potential military implications of human expansion beyond their home system. He deleted the message without responding and submitted a formal request for early retirement from the research service. His stated reason was accumulated stress from decades of xenological fieldwork. The real reason was his certainty that any further study of human military capabilities would either drive him to complete madness or force him to reveal truths that would panic the entire galaxy. The Council approved his retirement with full honors, unaware that their most experienced military analyst had chosen silence over service rather than confront the implications of humanity's true nature. Thrix settled on a quiet agricultural world where he spent his remaining years tending gardens and trying to forget what he had learned about the species that would someday inherit the galaxy. Late at night, when sleep eluded him despite his peaceful surroundings, Thrix would sometimes access news feeds from human space. He watched reports of their technological advances, their expanding colonies, and their growing cooperation in space exploration. Each development filled him with dread, not because humans were becoming more dangerous, but because they were becoming exactly what he had feared. The most powerful and most worthy inheritors of galactic civilization that any species could imagine.